Good morning, everyone. My name is Lindsay Wong, and I am an author and associate professor of creative writing at the English department at the University of Winnipeg. I'm a Chinese woman with blonde hair, and there is a painting of maple leaves behind me. I want to welcome you all to our fourth event for our Publishing Speaker Series 2024. And today we are featuring a reading and Q&A with acclaimed author Jamie Chai Yun Liew, who is a beautiful novelist who handles complex topics such as migration, motherhood, and mental illness with such finesse and care. A brilliant scholar, generous friend, mentor, and someone I'm so thrilled to share literary community with. Today's event will be recorded, so if you do not want to be on camera, please keep your video off. We also ask that you keep your mics muted. We have a lot of great questions submitted already, so we'll only turn to the chat if there is time. Thank you so much to the English department and the research office at the University of Winnipeg for your support of this event. Today, we acknowledge that we live and work in the territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, Dene, Métis, and Oji-Cree nations. The University of Winnipeg sits in Treaty 1 territory, the ancestral and traditional homeland of Anishinaabe peoples. As a settler of color writer, I am not only committed to honoring and following the lead of the land, water, and cultural protectors of this space, but I'm also a constant and forever student of the remarkable stories and their tellings by Indigenous peoples here and around this world. So thank you for the space, and I'm very grateful for everyone for joining us today. And if you feel moved to, please share where you're coming from in the chat on Zoom. So I'm very, very excited to welcome Jamie Chai Yun Liew, who is a writer, lawyer, professor, and podcaster, multi-talented. It takes a lot of skill to do all these amazing jobs. Her debut novel, Dandelion, was published by Arsenal Pulp Press in 2022, was longlisted for Canada Reads 2023, and that's a huge deal for anyone who knows CanLit, and won the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop Jim Wong Chu Emerging Writers Award in 2018. Her latest book, Ghost Citizens, Decolonial Apparitions of Stateless, Foreign, and Wayward Figures in Law, was published in 2024 by Fernwood Publishing, and it challenges popular legal and academic assumptions of citizenship. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jamie. I think we should all be clapping.
Thank you. That was such a really nice introduction, especially from someone whose writing I so admire. So it's wonderful for me to join you today.
Thanks, Jamie. I'm wondering, would you be able to start off with a brief reading?
Yeah, I'll read from my latest book called Ghost Citizens. And I know Lindsay herself is a fan of ghost stories and scary things. So I thought I'd read a little bit from the first chapter. And yeah. When I was a little girl, I heard ghost stories. These were not the ghost stories you might have heard at summer camp around a fire. They were folk tales my aunties told that people feared and believed. They were told to teach lessons, but to also instill a respect of the unknown, our ancestors, and of the things that may affect our fate. One of the most memorable stories told to me was of a woman known as Pontianak. I remember this story because my auntie, visiting from Southeast Asia, was shocked to find a small banana tree as a plant flanking our bay window. She warned me that Pontianak lives in banana trees and that she is a vengeful spirit that can inflict bad luck on those around her. I never looked at that plant the same way again. Yuan Ben Lee Adrian, a scholar in communication and film studies, explains the Pontianak is a widely recognized, most dreaded supernatural being in Malay folklore and mythology. Described as a fearsome mythical creature with vampire-like qualities, she's said to have fangs possess ghost-like traits that can only be subdued using a sharp object, which is usually a nail stuck to the back of her neck. She's also recognized for her high-pitched shrieks, long flowing hair, and fondness for the blood of children. Despite possessing such fearsome and horrifying characteristics, the Pontianak peculiarly remains popular among Malaysian and Asian audiences. Pontianak's story has been retold in folklore as that of a beautiful woman who died shortly after giving birth. In some versions of the story, she died from the shock of hearing that her child was stillborn and then returns from the dead. She is the equivalent of the Western conception of the female vampire with her long black hair and long robe-like dress. Historical and modern sightings of Pontianak are frequent, with attestations and videos shared on social media. The myth of how she died or why she has come back has evolved. She conjures fear with the bad luck she can bring, and the ways in which to avoid or kill this spirit in violent ways are frequently discussed. Adrian explains that Pontianak is a figure that transcends traditional belief in folklore and popular culture, manifesting in cinematic representations in horror films. He finds her popularity increasing and discusses how Pontianak emerges as a form of living dead, transgressing normative forms of proper behavior, asking for repentance. Pontianak haunted me in Malaysia while I was conducting field research. Friends would send me videos where wispy apparitions would be seen floating on a dark highway. The superstitious side of me held a respect for the warnings and stories, but the scholar in me also started to see a parallel between the lived experiences of stateless persons and Pontianak. I began to believe again, like I did as a child, that ghosts, the living dead, were among us. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I just love that analogy, and it's so creepy to have that idea of hauntings. I think you should be writing a collection of horror stories for us.
This is definitely on my list of things to do. But yeah, I mean, I've always admired, especially your writing of all the creepy and the gross, and I aspire to kind of try to make an entree into that genre for sure.
I'm excited. We should talk more about that. I really want this collection of Southeast Asian mythology and folklore and superstition in my hands right now. So I have a couple of questions for you. And the first one is, so you're acclaimed writer, you're a lawyer, you're a podcaster, professor, you're multi-talented, and you write everything, from legal speak, novels, and lectures. Can you talk about your trajectory to becoming a published author and what draws you to approaching different genres and different occupations?
Yeah, thank you, Lindsay. So I came to being the life of being a writer very late in my life, I would say. And I think I always wanted to be a writer, but I was a typical Asian child where my parents really emphasized finding a practical and suitable living where you obtain stable income and, the prestige of having a legal degree and being a lawyer also didn't, hurt. And, you know, I think I was a bit of a pleaser when I was growing up and definitely had enough of that immigrant parent influence that I did follow that trajectory and became a lawyer. But then, a lot of being a lawyer and studying the law is about listening to other people's stories. And of the work that I do is around immigrant and migration work. And a lot of the stories really um, are important to convey in very compassionate and honest ways in order to garner any legal benefit. And so I saw a kind of symbiotic, um, I guess, relationship between writing and the law. And, I started to kind of dabble in creative writing. And then, I reached a certain point in my career where I was like, oh, I feel pretty secure in my job, but I want to see if I can do this. And so I really set out one day to see if I could write a novel, and Dandelion was the result. So I just say I just was very kind of um, I feel very lucky that I have the opportunity, the means to experiment, but also I feel like the law is very symbiotic relationship with creative writing. You see a lot of lawyers becoming writers, which is, I think, not a surprise given how similar the work can be sometimes.
It's so interesting you say that. We had Sonia Lally who came beginning of the term, and she actually went to law school too as well. We were actually at Columbia at the same time, but I didn't know her. Uh, And then so she turned to writing thrillers and romance with her law background, and here you are also writing novels. So it's so fascinating. And I think that's also really inspiring for students who have these types of backgrounds, especially
Mm,
immigrant backgrounds. And I think there's that pressure to do something practical because becoming a writer sometimes is not a feasible career. And I know my parents, for example, they didn't really take my job seriously until I got a professor job. And now they tell people that, oh, she's a teacher, right? She's not a writer, she's a teacher. So it's so interesting how our backgrounds really shape our career trajectories. And I think, because you come from, creative writing from another career path, for those students who have to work these practical jobs to support themselves, and many of our students here have to take care of their families. How do you navigate and balance these various roles?
yeah, that's a really great question, and one that I feel like I'm still trying to figure out, to be honest. I think it's a challenge, and um, you really have to love writing and love the process of it in order to make time for it, right? So, and I think it's so funny because I was just telling students who are writing, research papers in my class, they're trying to figure out what to write about. And I say, well, make sure you pick something interesting, otherwise you're not going to want to do it. So I always think about the fact that writing is very cathartic for me. It's something that I feel like it's a treat that I do. And so I try to just like, how some people might carve out time to go for a run or to schedule in like a massage or a downtime or something like that. I actually schedule in writing. I'm not one of those people that can write every day because of my schedule, because of the demands of my job and my family. So I do have to kind of deliberately plan chunks of time to write, and I try to keep it as sacred. And so that's one way that I try to manage and try to attend to it. But I also view it as a bit of a treat for myself. So I try to get as much of the stuff that stresses me out, that pushes my writing to the back burner, done in time so that I can feel really immersed in kind of that reward that I give myself to write. Yeah.
That's really good advice because I think we think of writing as sort of like a chore sometimes. It's hard, it's not fun, right? It's difficult, but if you think about it, oh, this is time to myself, it really helps.
Oh, okay. But she'll bring home a bunch of
Yeah.
stuff.
Excuse me, I think someone is unmuted. Thanks. Um, yeah, I think it's really helpful to think about it, time for yourself. It's like sort of like an indulgence, but also it's a luxury to be able to say, like, here are my thoughts for the world. And I think, it's such a great way of looking at it.
Yeah, I also think like it's a kind of funny thing to say, but sometimes if I don't if I don't get a chance to myself to write, sometimes I get grumpy about it too. And I'm just kind of like, oh, there's something, it's almost like exercise for me. Like I have to, and not to say that every time I write something good comes out of it, but it's just one of those things that you kind of have to go through, right? Periodically.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah. Because no
yeah.
one cares if you write, right? There's
Yeah.
no
It's not like for
deadline
like no one
sometimes.
cares if you go out for a run, but it's kind of like that for me. It's like I have to do it once in a while because it makes me feel good.
Mhm. Yeah, that need. Do you have any advice for aspiring writers who come from immigrant or working class backgrounds?
Yeah, I think my main piece of advice is, um, write what you care about, write what you love, write what interests you. And I think,
Mhm.
it's so easy. This is very like I find the writing world very common, has common threads with experiences in the legal world. I always tell students, it's great to get certain courses in your basket and certain skills and things like that. But I think building a successful career means doing the things that interest you the most and answering questions that um, keep you um, keep your mind kind of alive, kind of thing. And I have a lot of things that I'm passionate about, passionate to try to answer like deep questions. And I think writers all have something that they're trying to grapple with or answer. And so just to focus on that rather than trying to create something that might be um, palatable for something that is outside of your control or for an audience that you may not really um, resonate with.
Mhm. That's really good advice. You have to find the topic interesting yourself, right? Not
Mm,
just writing to please someone.
that's right. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think it's harder to write to please someone because um, I think writing should be enjoyable, right? And it should, like, it is work, but I think it's one of those things that I think have given me a lot of ways to sort out questions in my other areas of life. So one of the things I think is important is, when I was writing Ghost Citizens, I was writing Dandelion at the same time, and Ghost Citizens would not be called Ghost Citizens if Dandelion wasn't written at the same time. So I feel like my writing fuels my research, my legal practice, my teaching, and these processes of writing help me think through different things that I'm grappling with in other areas of my life. Yeah.
I love that. I did not know you were writing two books at the same time and how
It's
they
probably,
informed each other. I love hearing the backstories of how books are born.
yeah, it was the ghost story and the ghost motif in Dandelion that made me like kind of come back to it. And then I was like, this actually could be a really good way to explain the experience of statelessness and how states are ghosting its own citizens. So like all of that only came about because I was really fascinated with ghost stories and folk tales and wanted to write about it in a literary sense. And then I'm like, wait a second, maybe I can write about it in an academic or in legal sense too. So it's wonderful how things can grow from just kind of the act of writing and thinking through things, right?
That's great. I love that. And this relates to my next question. So you've written, two books, fiction and nonfiction. How would you describe your metamorphosis as a writer? Like, is your creative process the same as when you started, or is it different? I know you mentioned writing at the same time, and I love how it informs each other.
Yeah, it's so funny because I wrote Dandelion without an outline or a fully fleshed out plot in mind. And I tried to plot out the novel I'm working on now. And I think I've just come to the conclusion that I write differently for different purposes. So I'm definitely an outliner when I write legal academic papers or legal arguments, but I'm not for my creative writing. So it's also really interesting to see how I feel like I have a split personality when it comes to writing. But maybe it's because I'm so constricted and so I feel so confined in the strictures of what legal and academic writing demand that I don't want to be held back by outlines or plans or things like that. So I've abandoned any attempt at writing a plan or an outline for my second novel, and it's worked much better for me that way. So it's kind of interesting to discover that about myself. Um, Having said that, I kind of do the reverse. After I finish a draft, I do outline to make sure it makes sense and stuff like that. So I do that, but I do like writing several things at the same time because like maybe it's like killing two birds with one stone. They often fuel each other. And then if I'm feeling stuck with one project, then I can go to another one and feel like I've accomplished something. It's this terrible um, notion of feeling productive all the time, this kind of pressure of our society to make us feel like we always have to be producing. But I think I'm a product of that. And certainly whenever I'm feeling stuck, I do move from one project to the other. And then sometimes that working on that project will help me get unstuck with the other one.
That's amazing. I think we have opposite ways of writing. I cannot multitask. It's just one project at a time. I just can't leave it, right? Once I'm writing. And I always outline. I always tell my students, you have to write a synopsis. You have to do an outline. So it's so
I
interesting
think
that you
those
say the
are very,
opposite.
I
Sorry?
wish I could do that. I think it is very useful, especially because I teach that method of writing too for like in the law school. And so I find it really interesting that maybe it's just me in my creative process. But yeah, I think it is useful and helpful to do at some point. So I acknowledge I do end up outlining once I've written like a first draft just to be like, this is actually makes sense, or am I missing something? And it's a good exercise to have, but not sure when is the appropriate time for everybody to do it, right?
And I think it's good for students to hear that not one way is going to work for their
Mhm.
creative process, right? And it's good to try different ways to find what works for them.
Yeah.
Um, I'm wondering, has your relationship to writing, character, or plotting changed at all as you move forward? I mean, we're talking about plotting right now. And I ask this because a lot of students are wondering, does it get easier? Does writing get easier? Because I mean, I always joke that I want to gouge out my eyeballs when I'm writing because it's difficult for me. And I remember one student was complaining that, yeah, she keeps telling us writing is hard every class, and it's so offensive. And I'm like, okay, so writing is not hard for you. So I'm just so curious.
It is hard. It's extremely hard. I find it in some ways, like having published a book doesn't make it easier. Like it in a way, it almost is like this looming shadow where you're like, how come you're not writing as as much as you did before? It's just this kind of reminder, like, why is it not working out for me on the page? And it's really hard. Um, I do find sometimes I read back my work and then I'm like, what? This doesn't make any sense. What was I thinking? And then other times I read it and I'm like, oh, this is so good. I can't believe I read this. So like there are moments where there's just so much frustration that I like I've blocked off like 2 hours to write and there's only two readable sentences out of that, right? But I think the one thing that I try to remind myself is that just attending to the practice of writing is enough. Is good. Like I don't count the words and I don't count the sentences so much as I'm like, did I attend to it as much as I wanted to this week, kind of thing. And to be kind because there's going to be weeks where it's just going to be garbage, you know. And I think we have to get through the garbage to get to the good stuff too, right? Yeah,
Mhm.
and I find it very hard. Like people are like, "Oh, you seem so prolific," and I'm like, "Yeah, but it's it's not about being prolific. It's also the process is up and down, right? And it can be very personally emotional." Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, and I like your analogy of gouging your eye. There are definite moments where I'm like, oh my God, should I abandon this entire thing whatsoever? Well, so, and you, just returning to your idea of plotting, I don't have any secrets about plotting. I guess for me, I actually find that to be the most difficult part. I think building characters is easier for me. I, I kind of build the world and the characters in my head first, and then the plotting comes after. Um, and I find that to be difficult to create enough pacing that is um, going to be enjoyable for a reader, you know? That's a difficult thing to kind of measure and plot out. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And I think genre writers tend to follow more plot, whereas literary writers are drawn to character. And it really just depends on like what your interests are and what your strengths are as a writer, where you want to develop those areas, right?
Yeah, that
Mhm.
actually seems true to me because I really love reading romance novels, and there seems to be this like a predictable but very comforting arc that goes through a story. So I do enjoy that, and I wonder, I'm like, I wonder if it would make my life easier if there was like a formulaic, approach to a plot, right?
Yeah, it's like very much like what happens next, right? And then literary fiction is like how and why,
Yes. Yeah,
right?
and I'm more like those that kind of writing is more interesting to me personally to do, to be
Mhm.
immersed. Yeah.
Yeah, so interesting. And a lot of students are wondering, what do you do if you get stuck? Because we talked about hard writing days and having to sift through lots of paragraphs just to find those gems, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think with hard writing days, I think attending to the act of thinking about your writing or writing, I try not to be so harsh on myself about the actual act of typing or scribbling down words. And if I'm stuck, I start to read something. I'm one of those people. I know there's like apparently different ways of doing things, but some people are like, I never read my genre when I read or when I write. And other people are like, I can't help but read. And I'm one of those people that I need to read while I'm writing, like read other people's work and get inspired. So I thrive on reading other people's work to get me going. The other way is, as I said earlier, I sometimes switch between projects and then take inspiration from that work to go back to the other work. But I always don't leave it. Like I don't if I don't feel like the writing's going well, I don't just abandon it in that moment. I'm like, okay, what can I try to find prompts that will help me get going because otherwise it would just be endless weeks of like, I don't feel like writing or I'm not feeling it today. And I sympathize with that a lot. I've had that feeling a lot lately. And I think what's gotten me out of it is just getting inspired from other people's amazing work.
Oh, that's really good advice because we all have weeks where we're just like, okay, housework looks more interesting than writing, right? To actually sit down and do the work sometimes just feels not possible. But I think it's really important just to be like, okay, I have to do this, right? The Pomodoro method sometimes, or just, and I like how you said about reading, because I think there's something about reading that sparks something in the brain, right? And it's almost like as a writer, you ask yourself, can I write this sentence better than this author? Or how did they write this sentence? And can I learn from it, right? It comes
Sometimes
that.
just even reading a word, I'll just be like, oh my God, that word is such an interesting word. And then I like become obsessed with it. Do you know what I mean? And it
Mhm.
doesn't have to necessarily be fiction. Like I've read, sometimes I'll like sit down with a magazine and find an interesting story and just be like, oh, that's really interesting. And then it makes me think about something that I'm writing about. And then I start just jotting something down, right? So it could honestly be a newspaper article or I don't know, a pamphlet. Like there has been times where I read like, an old postcard from somebody and be like, this is really interesting, like it could be anything that really ignites something.
Mhm. Well, that's great advice. Thanks. A student was wondering, how do you stay focused and how do you have that stamina to finish a book length project? Because sometimes books take years, right? So how do you do that?
Yeah, I think that's true. There are moments where I'm like, wow, this is really, really big. Um, I think I do this similarly with my legal projects. I try to compartmentalize them. So I tend to write a lot of my books in like sections or chunks. And I try to like, so even if I'm not working on multiple projects, even within the same project, I see multiple projects and I'll be like, some of you might be writing, like, for example, multiple POV, and I'll work on one POV and then get tired of that and then move to the other one. And it seems new and exciting. Do you know what I mean? So I use different things like that to keep my mind feeling like it's new, like rewarding it. Kind of. I'm all about rewards and positive reinforcement. So those kinds of things. And if I know there are scenes that have to be written, sometimes I'll save them for a time where I feel inspired, or I'm like, okay, I'm ready to write this scene now, and then I'll shelve that other piece later, kind of thing. So I'm a true believer in compartmentalizing and then letting things sleep and lie for a little bit and revisiting them later.
It's really good advice. Yeah. I think I think I have this tendency to just go push forward at this point, right? You're thinking of the goal in mind, but I like the idea of finding something fresh and exciting in a book and then coming back to it. Because so often we get so immersed in our own projects that we start to lose that joy or ways to approach it, I think.
Mhm. I know writers who write chronologically, like in the book, like from beginning to end, and I find that really amazing because none of my projects are ever written from beginning to end that way. I always jump in between and then smush them together. And then, so that, that has helped me to kind of finish projects because then I see them as smaller pieces. And then when I finish a smaller piece, it feels like an accomplishment versus just one big long piece kind of thing. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm one of those writers, beginning to end.
That's so interesting. See,
Yeah,
I really
we're just
marvel at that.
yeah, we're
That's
just
so
complete
good.
opposites to how we approach, or maybe how our brains work, right? I'm just like, okay, A, B, C, done.
I think I'm a little bit like ADHD, so I'm kind of like I get distracted by things. So I kind of harness that distraction by refocusing it on a different section or something.
So interesting. So going back to ghost citizens, you talked about ghost sightings and Southeast Asian superstition. What was it like writing about it and putting that into your current book?
Yeah, I think it was one of the most rewarding things to kind of um, think back to how seminal, you know, those stories that you hear literally at the dinner table. Like, I'm not lying when I say it was my aunt who freaked out in our kitchen one day when she arrived from Southeast Asia visiting us and was like, what the heck is that doing there? I'm like, what are you talking about? She's like, that banana tree. It was such a seminal moment in my childhood and obviously was seared into my brain that I had to write about it in two separate books in two different ways. So it's really nice to kind of reignite and use memory that way, but also to kind of push the boundaries of what we think folktales and ghost stories can do to explain certain phenomena or to ignite questions about how we live together as a society or how we understand certain kinds of lived experiences. So, yeah, it's just been really nice to arrive at a point where I feel like our stories are finally being appreciated and matter and can be featured in ways that um, are accessible to a bigger and wider audience. So, yeah, it's very gratifying to see those kinds of stories in print. I don't know if you feel this way too. Like, stories you write about are so familiar. And I don't know if you've heard from other people saying it's so nice to see those kinds of things on print, in print, and out in the world, you know?
Actually, I have not, but it's interesting
I'm
that you
shocked
say
to hear
that.
this.
Yeah, I'm always shocked because I think like when I know we've had these discussions, like I always get like, hey, you're too weird, you're too niche, right? You're not mainstream enough. And so it's just, I think it's really validating when I talk to, authors like you and people in our community who are like, I'm so glad that you're allowed to publish this. Because I think, 20, 30 years ago, we wouldn't be able to tell our stories in Kenlit.
Yeah. And even I'll be honest with you, like Ghost Citizens went through an academic peer review process. And
Mhm.
typical peer reviewer number two was saying, oh, some of the personal references in there were campy. Like the fact that I talked about my father's previous status as a stateless person and the term ghost citizen they thought was problematic. And so you will get pushback still, right? I left the publisher I was intending to publish with first because they wouldn't support that me in my pushback to this reviewer. So I guess I would say that, yeah, it's so important for us to also kind of stand our ground and just be like, yeah, you guys might find it weird and gross and whatever, but this is us. And let me just say that I love your book so much, Lindsay, and I
Oh,
saw
thank
so much.
you.
It felt like going home in some ways, but also it was just edgy and funny. Like it wasn't exactly the way in which I experienced things growing up, but it was also funny and edgy, which is like another elevated way to experience it in a different way. You know what I mean? So important that we have these things out there.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. And I think that's like really good advice that you can stand up to a publisher, right? You can say, no, it's your book. You can walk away.
Mhm.
Right?
It wouldn't be the same book otherwise.
Exactly, right? Your vision is important. So I think, mhm. Great. I guess this also leads to the my next question. So when I visited Ottawa last year, you were just so kind and you took me to eat delicious Asian food. Something that I miss a lot in Winnipeg. They don't have my rice noodles with my tendons and my
Oh,
yeah, so I'm always sad. And then we were talking about, certain subjects and Asian Canadian writers are sometimes limited to writing. Like we said, you're too weird, too marginalized. And, as I mentioned, Dandelion draws on some difficult and complicated topics like migration, motherhood, and mental illness. And do you think there's this expectation for women of color to write about certain subjects and follow cultural narratives in order to be successful in mainstream publishing?
yeah. In fact, as much as I love Dandelion, sometimes I have a bit of guilt that that book really contributes to the ongoing genre of trauma porn and,
Mhm.
the terrible ways in which people experience migration and racism in Canada. Um, and I felt like I had to establish myself in that genre first in order to be recognized as a writer. And it's given me a little bit of freedom now to think about what I want to write about now. Like previous to that, like I have several ideas for a book, and there was actually another book I wanted to write, but then I ended up writing Dandelion first because I'm like, oh,
Mhm.
and kind of like getting into a starter home. You want to kind of test the waters a little bit, right? So I felt like Dandelion was a bit, if I may be so honest, it was a bit of a starter novel for me to see if I could
Mhm.
write a novel, and I was pretty safe in my choices in that novel. Um, yeah, and it does pain me to, in some ways, to in some ways I do have these moments of cringe where I look back on it and I'm like, oh, it does kind of contribute to that expected norm of how and what we produce.
Hmm.
Having said that, it is interesting the kind of feedback that I've gotten. So the one thing that has made me heartened by the fact that the book exists is that I do get a lot of feedback from non-racialized people who say, I learned a lot. I didn't know
Hmm.
that's what the term stateless meant, or that this condition even existed. So, even if there was just one person who wrote me that, it was worth it for me to write that novel, despite my own kind of criticism, I guess I would have of my own work now.
Hmm. Yeah, no, it's so interesting because so many writers feel like we have to produce our trauma on the page, right? In order to get that recognition. I think also my first book, it did follow those conventions of mental illness. And also I was giving people this emotional trauma, right? And then with this, the short story collection, I think it took it took the funny in the trauma. And I think people didn't recognize it. And I think that book did not do as well as my first book because people didn't recognize it, right? And I
Yeah,
think that's something about readers expecting our trauma to be there for them, right? In this accessible way, right? And I think there's that's something to be said about CanLit and its state.
yeah. And in fact, yesterday I was hosting Angela Starrett at our law school, and I had this trauma-informed lawyer interview her, and she said such a poignant thing at the beginning. She said, your book is not trauma porn. You don't like
Mhm.
lay out all the gross details of what happened to murdered and missing Indigenous women, but yet they're beautiful portraits of humanity and these women. And it's interesting that for people who are writing from a racialized background, that we have to perform trauma sometimes in order to get um, a platform or in order to get heard. And why can't our humanity just be laid on the page um, in the ways that we live other than our trauma, right? And I think it's really interesting the expectations in CanLit around this, and sometimes the pushback when we don't give enough of that, right? So it's yeah.
Yeah, there's always that criticism, like we don't understand this. You're too weird, or why would you air your family's dirty laundry? Like, things like that, right? That
Yeah.
writers get. Hmm.
Yeah, or just not even like understanding that you're like, I think your second, like your book of short stories was just like gender or genre bending, like I'm losing my words now. But like it's just, well, like why can't we experiment and just enjoy the journey of reading that instead of trying to fit it into something that we know already, right?
Hmm. For sure, that risk taking is not appreciated as much.
Mhm.
Hmm. And I'm also really curious to hear your thoughts about readers often mistaking or reading BIPOC's fiction as autobiography and memoir. And I know that comes from this racist assumption that, BIPOC authors, we lack imagination, that we can't write outside our lived experiences. Did you have that experience with Dandelion? Did people think you were the narrator?
Yeah, all the time. I thought that this was common amongst everyone, but then I started to hear like, you know, stories about the fact that it's really just us that have to deal with it. And it's actually quite frustrating to the point where I've had to actually correct people. Like people take it as fact and they will talk to me like it's fact. And I'll be like, no, that's not real. I just want to set the record straight. Or I'll have to be in conversation with someone and they've made an assumption. I'm like, where did you get that from? They're like, oh, I read it in your book. And I'm like, yes, but that's not real. So it's really awkward that people have made these assumptions and then feel like this is permission for them to talk to me in a certain way that they think is an intimate permission to talk to me in a certain way, right?
Mhm.
So I have found that kind of surprising um, and a little bit like just presumptuous, to be honest, and a bit hurtful. Like, some of the things that people assume is just really mind-boggling. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. And it's like it's fiction. Like, how do you think it's me? It's so baffling to me that, how sometimes readers how they read something and then they react and assume. Even with the collection I was writing, there's some stories in medieval China or whatever. And I'm like, no, that is not me. I didn't live,
Yeah.
in the 13th century or whatever. Um, and and it's like, do people like, I don't understand sometimes with readers. So I'm sorry about that.
No, I mean, it's interesting. It's kind of, it's eye-opening, but it's also made me think about the fact that maybe like I can see why people write with a pseudonym now, so that there aren't
Mhm.
assumptions made about what they're reading about that person, right? There's a curiosity about where the story comes from, right? And I can see why pseudonyms are used sometimes now.
Mhm. Yeah, maybe we should all just use pseudonyms in fiction. No one would know who we were. They could just get us confused at literary festivals.
It's true, actually, right? It's just like, oh, it's another Asian writer.
Yep, they'll never be able to tell us apart. And that's probably why they never invite us to the same festivals, right? They don't want us in the same panels because we
Confusing.
like scared the audience couldn't tell us apart.
That's good.
Yes. So in my workshops, we're always talking about literary genealogy, and I'm wondering if you might discuss how some of these literary grandparents or cousins or aunties help shape your work. So essentially, I'm asking like, well, what on the page, what writers are you in conversation with?
Oh my goodness, that's such a great question. Um, well, you. Um,
Oh, I'm honored.
No, it's true. There's always, I feel like the canon, like to be honest, I met Wei Sin Choi right before. Probably one of the reasons why I won the Asian Canadian Writers Workshop. He told me about the ACWW. So, Wei Sin Choi, of course. Authors like Carrie Ann Leong and um, Kai Cheng Tom. Like, there's so many fierce Asian writers that have like plowed the way and made the path possible. Um, there's so too many to name, and I'm probably going to neglect so many names, but Denise Chong here in Ottawa was very kind to me early in my career as well. So people who've written decades ago that I think probably face challenges that I can only imagine. Um, as much as I write to my own community, um, I am cognizant about writing to people outside of my community because I think there's a huge increase in dehumanization in the ways in which people talk about racialized people. Um, and part of my work prior to becoming, a writer, but my work as a lawyer is like really just demystifying the experience of people and how badly law can hurt people and what that feels like.
Mhm.
Um, and I think it's really hard for some communities to understand because they never will experience that. And so if there's any, writing for me has been a vehicle for me to allow them access to it in a certain way, right? And people have told me that. And I think that's great. Like, so I do write with that in mind as well, that I want people to begin the process of seeing communities that seem distant to them as human.
Mhm. No, that's like a beautiful way of putting it, right? When we write that our book, it's like our gift to the world in that sense, right? It's like that experience that you can never really have unless you've lived in someone's shoes.
Hmm. Hmm. For sure. It's yeah, and in some ways, like I feel like Dandelion was kind of like um a way for me to kind of put a historical stamp at it in a period of time in Canada, what this experience was like in a particular time in particular geographic locations. Like, and if nothing else, that's just that for me. It's like my way of kind of giving a particular lens into one experience, right?
Mhm. Yeah, it's amazing. And then I'm just gonna switch topics here. So in this class, we're doing a dialogue assignment. So I'm making them pair up into groups and write dialogue. Could you give us some tips on how you write dialogue and come up with distinct voices? And any tips that you have for students or new writers who have difficulty coming up with these three-dimensional characters?
Yeah, I am one of those people that sometimes when I make sure I have like those regular writing times, I begin to think about my characters when I'm commuting, when I'm driving, when I'm washing the dishes or something or cooking, right? I become immersed, not like, so I'm not a very big plot person, but I'm a more of a living in a character's kind of world. And sometimes for dialogue, I just try to become that person. I just kind of reread this section I wrote this morning for my next novel, and I just started laughing. And I'm like, I would never like say these things, but I love that this person said these things because some ways it's like in the recesses of my head that I think this person's so funny and so jarring, and I really enjoy that person, but I'm not that person. So just living it, and then it's kind of like spending time with a friend and trying to unearth their words and put it on the page, right? So that's kind of how I do it, but I know it's different for everybody.
Hmm. Yeah, and going back to Dandelion, when you wrote voices for Lily and Sweet Hua, how did you get those voices? Like, how did you go about? Was it just sort of just thinking about like how would I say this, or was it about listening to conversations and thinking about family members?
I kind of try to visualize it like I'm watching a film. Like sometimes
Mm,
dialogue for me is like, how would this play out if I was watching this on TV? Um, and so I'll write a dialogue and then I'll kind of read it and try to visualize it and then tweak it. It's kind of funny because a lot of early feedback I got was that maybe I shouldn't be writing from a child's point of view with Lily. I got a lot of pushback on that, but I felt like I really wanted that innocence to be taken away, and that that point can only happen from a child's point of view. So that that was actually difficult for me to kind of go back and edit in a way that was true to a child's perspective, and because I'm not a child anymore, but I had to kind of
mhm,
really embody that presence. And then with Suihua, I think it was easier because she was a little bit more open in her language. Like with Lily, she was a little bit more careful and deliberate. But Suihua was fun to write because I really felt like she was free with the way she communicated. So again, just like trying to imagine and kind of be and embody those characters and kind of like
mhm. Oh, that's really
entering.
good advice. Yeah, I'm having them record it and play it back to them so they can hear it and then go back
Yes,
to
that's
to
fun.
writing. So
Yeah,
yeah.
it's fun because the other thing is like sometimes you write and then you read it back and you're like, oh, people don't talk like that, you know, so you have to make it believable in the parlance that we have in our daily conversations, right?
Mhm. And the trick, I think, is not making it too believable to not, right? Because they can have the
Yeah.
ums and the ahs. And
I
yeah.
think the trickiest part about dialogue too is making choices about what's said and what's not said, right? And giving the reader enough credit that they will get through the silences too, or what's not said, and they'll pick up the meaning that not everything needs to be said, right?
Yes, not everything needs to be said. You want to be subtle, but not too subtle,
I
right?
know it's a tricky balance.
Yes. And then for the aspiring readers and our students out there, should we be thinking about the audience and how our work will be perceived while we're writing our drafts, or is this something that we should just worry about later, right? Because we're
I
always talking about audience, right?
Yeah. I when I'm actually like in the act of writing, I don't think about the audience. And in fact, I have a writing project right now where the only way I can write about it is thinking that I'm going to write it with a being a pseudonym in mind,
Mm.
and just having that freedom of just not having any outsiders kind of influence what I could write. Um, I think it's important not to let audience distract you because it really can affect the choices that you can make. At least for me, it does. Um, I think when I have a finished draft, I might think about audience at that time. But again, you know, for both my books, I didn't think about audience, and I thought about it in more in the editing process, maybe in terms of is this intelligible? Would people understand this? Does it flow? But to the extent of whether it drives me, I think it actually distracts and inhibits my process if I think about audience. And I try not. In fact, I found it easier to write when I wasn't outed as a writer. Like before my book was published, nobody knew I was writing a novel, and it was quite freeing to not have an audience, so to speak. That I was
Mhm.
writing for myself.
Yeah, you can never get that feeling back again, that secrecy and privacy of the first book because you think no one's going to read it. And
Yes.
then that pressure, right? When you're thinking about, okay, this book is more people are going to read it, my second book, and then my third book, and so on.
Yeah, I actually think it's better to be unknown in writing in that space and pretending that you're writing it just for yourself, right?
Mhm. Yeah, that privacy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mhm. And then for new writers, what are some faux pas or things that they shouldn't do?
I guess I would say, you know, writing is it's very tempting in our day and age to kind of get validation or assurance that you're on the right track. I guess I would say is resist the urge to share your writing until you're done.
Mhm.
It is so easy to just be like, can you read this? Does it sound good? Or um, can you reassure me that this is great writing or that it makes sense or whatever? And I think sit with your writing and let it stew with you for a long time before sharing and make sure it is of the quality that you aspire it to be before you share it in the world. Because I think asking someone to read your work is a huge undertaking, first of all. And you want to be able to give work that is um, worth their time. Do you know what I mean? But I think it's so easy in our day and age to be like, to get, we live in such a terrible time now where the likes and the sometimes fuel us, and I think for me, I think there's something to be said about slow writing and slow thinking and letting it percolate and revisiting and then and the craft of it and enjoying that process and keeping it to yourself. You know, um, and then that's a time where you can feel, at least for me, I feel I can share it with somebody and not feel as guilty about taking up their time to get their feedback or whatever, and also recognizing it does take labor and time. And what are ways in which you want to compensate or thank them or show gratitude for that work to do that. So I think that's something that I struggle with. There's a lot of people that demand you of your time as a writer and just to be very aware that we have so many demands on us, right? And to be careful about those asks and to do it in a very respectful way, and one that is attentive to the time and respect that time that they're taking, right?
Mhm. That's a really good point. It's not querying, not sending your book out until it's ready, and not just coming up to a published writer and being like, "Can you read my manuscript?" Right? Because it's like you said, it's an enormous undertaking.
It's really surprising to me how many people actually do that to me. I'm like, we've never met before.
Right?
You've said just two sentences to me and you want to send an entire manuscript to me. And I'm like, can you think about what that means for that person? Do you know what I mean? And I get why they're asking, but I never would have asked somebody like that when I was in that stage. And in fact, when I paid someone. Like I
Right.
recognized the work involved. And so just to be careful about what you're asking other people to do with your work and time and things like that. So I just,
Mhm. Yeah, really good advice. In the interest of time, would you like to do a lightning round? Yeah,
yes.
I gave this to Jenny for her book launch recently, and I'm so interested in comparing your answers. So Jenny is our mutual friend, and she teaches at UW, for those of you who don't know.
I hear her answers
Um,
afterwards.
okay, this will be fun. Being an author is like fill in the blank.
Being an author is like having superpowers, I feel like, because you just can't believe you created a whole entire world and new characters and people believe it's real.
That's a great answer. Superpowers. I like your positivity. One thing you wish you had known before becoming a creative writer.
That I could have done this a long time ago. I wonder how many books I could have written, to be honest.
So interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, you could have started, I guess. You could have like 10 by now because you multitask.
I don't know. Maybe I wouldn't be the person I am today, though, right?
That's true. Yeah. It's hard to know. Your writerly superpower.
Oh my gosh. My superpowers, I read really fast. Like I love reading.
Mm,
So maybe that, yeah.
yeah. You and Jenny, I don't know, you're speed readers and speed writers.
Yeah, like my husband would be like, "You finished that book already? Didn't you just start that yesterday?" And I'm like, "I know, I loved it." And he's just like, "Did you absorb anything?" And I'm like, "I did."
How dare you ask me that question?
I know.
So funny. So, what are some books you wish you had written, or something that you admire or envy in other writers' styles or writing habits?
Um, I just read in the summer this book called Brotherless Night, and it is an amazing historical fiction. And I'm just like, I've just been going down this rabbit hole of Sri Lankan literature. This is other Sri Lankan writer that wrote really funny. I actually really admire people who can write funny things like you, but also people who can really write deep into historical context. Like those are the two things that I really admire. So funny things, because I can't do funny very well, and historical fiction. That's
Mm,
a whole other like ball of wax that I really admire.
really cool. Maybe you should write historical fiction, like a humorous historical fiction. You can do it. You'd be great. Pet peeve in contemporary literature.
I think you hit it on the nose when you asked me that question about that that people make assumptions that they know me. They come up to me like
Mhm,
they know me because they've read my book, and that's a pet peeve of mine. Yeah,
Mine too. I'm just like, go away.
it's like you don't know anything about me.
Yeah, right. Or sometimes I'm like, oh, wrong Asian, and I just walk away. Uh,
uh,
how would you commit the perfect murder and get away with it? I'm asking because I always say like writers are very good at planning murder. And because you're a lawyer, you would know which lawyers to call to defend you.
well, if I told you, then it wouldn't be the perfect murder.
Oh, okay. I have to be suspicious now. Three dead writers that you would take with you on a 6 month residency on a tropical island and why? And let's assume that we're going to reanimate them as zombies.
Ooh, Mary Shelley,
Ooh.
um, Iris Chang, who wrote The Rape of Nanking. She
Mm.
had a very sad life, and I think she was very affected by things she researched. And Toni Morrison, gotta have someone from the canon there, you know? Yeah.
Right. I'm gonna come, all right, we're gonna reanimate these zombies together with you.
Yes. Yes.
Great. And my last one, your most embarrassing moment at a literary event. We can skip this one, but of course I'm gonna come back and hound you later because I want to know.
Oh my gosh, most embarrassing. Um, hmm. I think it was probably, hmm. Oh, I know the perfect one. I was with a an author that I just met, and we were getting to our hotel at a literary festival, and she's like, "Oh my gosh, I think that's Heather O'Neill over there." And I'm like, "I think you're right." And we were both like really starstruck, and I'm like, "I have her book in my suitcase." So she's like, "Let's go up and say hi." So we go and say hi, and we're like blubbering, fangirling Heather O'Neill, and she's like getting into the elevator, and we're like, and I just kept saying to her, "Your book is in my bag." And I'm like trying to think, should I open my luggage to prove to her that I'm reading her book right now? And then I'm like, I really wanted to sign it, but she's like about to get in the elevator. And then she's just kind of like, I think she could probably thought we were just really cute fans. And she's like, "That's great. Thanks. See you." And then I'm just like, oh no, I missed my opportunity to get her to sign my book. But it was just, we just looked like blubbering fools. So it's kind of embarrassing. But
No, I'm sure she understood, right?
yes, but it's also just in retrospect, and we're just like, we just acted like we were like schoolgirls who were, running up to her and saying, "Oh my God, we love your books,"
Hmm. Yeah, I'm always like embarrassed. Even though I think I recognize someone, I'm just like, I don't think I'll go up to them. And just in case I get this person wrong.
I know. That's the thing. We were just like, I think it's her. And then we were right. And then we were totally unprepared in our approach to sounding like legit authors and smart people that we can engage with her. But anyways.
That's hilarious. I love it. Well, thank you so much, Jamie, for taking the time to visit us. I know you're so busy with your classes and books and other things.
I always love being in conversation with you, Lindsay, and I learned so much from you. And honestly, it's an honor that you asked me. I was really touched, and
Oh,
thank you.
well, thank you for coming. We should all be clapping for Jamie.
Good luck, everyone, with your writing projects. I'll be sending good vibes your way.
Yeah, their first assignment is due on Friday.
Ooh, okay, good luck, everybody.
Yeah, good luck. Um, I'm going to stop recording.